So picture this for a second. You walk into a natural history museum.
Okay.
Or, maybe you're standing in the middle of some ancient, long-forgotten ruin somewhere. There is this very specific psychological trap that almost all of us fall into.
Right, the museum voice thing.
Exactly. You see this massive, complex artifact sitting behind a pane of temperature-controlled glass. It could be like the intricate, corroded bronze gears of a water clock, or maybe a towering astrolabe used for ancient navigation.
Something that just screams ancient and important.
Yeah. And because it's old, and because it's encased in a museum display with that little brass plaque underneath it,
You just kind of stare at it.
you just stare. You admire the gold plating if there's any left. You marvel at the sheer craftsmanship required to build it without modern tools. You treat it with this quiet, passive reverence. But, and this is the trap, you almost never take a step back and ask the most fundamental question.
Which is, what did this thing actually do?
Yes. Wait, what mechanical problem was this machine actually built to solve?
That is a wildly pervasive phenomenon. It becomes a relic to be revered, rather than a piece of functional technology to be understood.
Right.
The moment something is categorized as ancient or sacred, we just tend to divorce the object from its utility. We strip away its original practical context. In our minds, it becomes completely binary.
How do you mean?
Like, it's either a magical piece of history that we just look at with uncritical awe, or it's just a shiny paperweight from the past. We lose the engineering of it. We lose the mechanics.
Which is exactly the framework we need for what we're peeling back the glass on today. Because we are looking at ancient texts, and specifically, we're plunging into the highly analytical concepts found in the Tolu-e-Islam series.
A phenomenal source.
It really is. And we're focusing our lens entirely on Lecture 117. This specific lecture breaks down the introductory verse, the Tamheed of Surah 17, which is known as Bani Israel. And right out of the gate, this source material forces us to confront a massive roadblock in how humanity typically processes ancient, religiously significant texts. It addresses what we could call the placeholder problem.
The placeholder problem, that's actually the perfect diagnostic term for this. Because historically, when audiences approach a text like Surah 17, verse 1, which famously describes this night journey, they tend to strip away all the sociological weight,
Totally.
all the political context, the systemic implications. It all just gets thrown out.
Yeah.
They treat the text as a mystical fairy tale.
Like a bedtime story.
Exactly, a bedtime story of magical, impossible travel, or perhaps just a theological placeholder that demands blind, unquestioning awe. The text is treated as an artifact behind glass.
Look, don't touch.
Right. The reader is basically told to admire the supernatural element, bow their head, and move on without ever asking how this event actually functioned within the mechanics of human history.
Well, our mission for this deep dive, and I'm talking directly to you listening to this right now, is to completely shatter that glass. We want to move you from a state of passive reverence without understanding to a state of absolute conviction through reason.
That's a huge shift.
It's massive because the source material we are working with today demands that we re-examine this text not as some detached mystical event, but as a rigid, profound, mathematically precise blueprint for human evolution, systemic movement, and civilizational shift.
And to accomplish that, we have to entirely change the lens through which we view the narrative. I mean, the Tolu-Islam analysis argues that this opening verse is not just a recount of an individual's magical flight through the night sky.
Right.
It is actually a masterclass in what the text essentially describes as social physics.
Social physics. I love that term.
It fits perfectly because it's outlining the exact mechanics of how a corrupt society reacts to a paradigm shift, how highly refined human capital is forged under immense crushing pressure, and why strategic migration is a fundamental law of nature rather than, a desperate act of cowardice.
So let's start building this out. Because to understand the blueprint, we first have to understand the crucible in which it was being forged.
The environment.
Exactly. The source sets the stage in ancient Mecca. We're talking about the Prophet of Islam. But the text asks us to step away from the purely religious caricature of a man just preaching on a street corner.
Right. It's not just a guy holding a sign.
No. It asks us to view him as a visionary who is actively challenging a deeply entrenched, highly corrupt establishment. We're talking about 13 long years in Mecca. And the source makes it extremely clear that this was not a period of polite philosophical disagreement.
Oh, far from it. The lecture paints a very vivid, historically grounded picture of a daily, unrelenting siege. We have to look at the socioeconomic reality of Mecca at that time. It was a hub of trade, a center of wealth, and its entire power structure was built on vested interests. Monopolies, systemic inequalities, and a ruling class that maintained its grip through very specific religious and economic paradigms.
So they were making serious money off the status quo.
Insane amounts of money and power. So when this new ideology was introduced, it wasn't merely asking the elite to change their personal, private prayers. It was a direct existential threat to their entire economic and social monopoly.
It threatened their wallets.
Their wallets, their influence, their entire hierarchy. Because of that, the ruling class was actively, methodically plotting to crush the movement. I mean, they were scheming day and night to assassinate the leader and extinguish the ideology before it could disrupt their systems of control.
Just think about the sheer psychological and physical toll of that environment. 13 years.
It's unfathomable.
That is over 4,700 days of waking up knowing that the most powerful resource people in your city, the people who control the economy, the people who control the narrative, want you dead.
And they're not just wishing for it, they are deploying every tactic. Economic boycotts, physical violence, psychological warfare.
Right. And this is where the linguistic analysis in our source material completely flipped my understanding of the text. Because the verse itself, Surah 17, verse 1, opens with the word subhan.
A very loaded word.
Very. Now, conventionally, this is translated simply as glory be to him. As a reader, you typically gloss over that. You think, okay, standard theological vocabulary, just a chant of praise.
Sure.
But the lecture redefines this word's function entirely within the context of those 13 years.
The source is incredibly precise with the linguistics here. It argues that subhan is not meant to be read as a mystical incantation or a passive statement of praise. If we look at the linguistic roots explored in the text, the word is a declaration of highness, of superior exaltedness. But in this specific, gritty context of Meccan persecution, it serves a highly functional purpose. It is a statement that the divine plan and the natural laws governing that plan operate on a plane that is entirely out of the grip of the disbelievers' plots.
So it's not just a cosmic shield protecting someone from a sword strike. It is a statement of structural, systemic superiority.
Precisely. The opponents are scheming day and night, utilizing all their wealth and local political power to assassinate the visionary and destroy the movement.
Right. They think they have the upper hand.
But the verse opens with subhan to declare that their local ground-level tactics are fundamentally incapable of disrupting the overarching systemic law.
Wow.
It is the text's way of stating, basically, the natural laws governing this civilizational shift operate at a frequency so high, your petty, desperate assassination plots cannot even intersect with them.
It has such a powerful reframe.
It transitions the entire narrative from a space of fearful superstition to a space of unyielding systemic law. The source emphasizes that while the enemies were confidently claiming we will wipe this ideology out, the opening of the verse is a cold, authoritative response saying, you do not even have access to the mechanism that is driving this.
Okay, I understand the concept of systemic superiority, but, and I have to push back here, what about the mechanics of what happens next in the text?
Okay, let's hear it.
The verse immediately transitions into describing a travel. The famous journey from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, Masjid al-Haram to Masjid al-Aqsa.
Right.
And it explicitly says this happened at night. So if the divine plan is so untouchable, if this movement is operating on a plane of absolute structural superiority, why does the travel happen under the cover of darkness? Right. I mean, a night departure inherently implies vulnerability, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you are untouchable, why are you sneaking away in the dark? It feels contradictory to the whole premise of Subhan.
That is a critical friction point, and it's exactly the kind of question the text anticipates. If we view the travel merely as an escape, the night setting absolutely looks like vulnerability.
It looks like running away.
It looks like someone running for their life. But the lecture dismantles this by shifting our entire understanding of what this travel actually was. It was not a panicked reactionary escape from a localized assassination attempt.
So what was it?
Well, if we connect this to the broader philosophical continuity of the Quran as outlined in the source, the text states that the messenger's life was strictly tied to a broader, highly structured mission. Every phase had a purpose. The night does not represent fear. In the text's framework, it represents the unseen transition between phases.
Meaning it wasn't about physical survival at all. It was a scheduled milestone in the blueprint.
Exactly. And the source anchors this by quoting the verse's own explicit reasoning for the travel. The text does not say the travel occurred to save him from his enemies. The text says the travel occurred to show him the signs, the ayatina.
Ah, the Ayat.
Yes. This single phrase transitions the entire event from a desperate, fearful escape to a necessary educational and strategic maneuver. The physical movement was required to reveal the next phase of the blueprint. It was a calculated, necessary transition dictated by the laws of social physics the text is outlining.
Let's really dig into these signs, these Ayatina, because the way the source describes them is fascinating, and it completely strips away the magical thinking we usually apply to this story.
Completely.
It explicitly argues that these signs were not supernatural fireworks in the sky. They weren't magical tricks meant to dazzle the viewer. The text describes these signs as the rumblings of a massive, impending social revolution that was brewing within the conscience of the universe.
That is an incredibly heavy phrase, within the conscience of the universe.
Right. But the key point the source makes is that at that specific stage, during those 13 grueling years in Mecca, these signs were entirely invisible to the naked eye.
Which is the fundamental nature of all profound systemic shifts. I mean, they don't begin with sudden, visible changes in physical borders or the immediate toppling of infrastructure.
They start underground.
Exactly. They begin with mindsets shifting, with ideological frameworks being constructed in the abstract. And what's truly compelling here is how the text frames the very concept of travel.
Okay, unpack that.
The physical movement wasn't just a change of scenery to get away from bad people. The text presents travel as an engine of reason itself.
How so? Like, how does physical movement act as an engine for reason?
Think about the ideological signs that were being developed during those 13 years. You have revolutionary concepts of human equality, the radical dismantling of corrupt economic monopolies, the establishment of a completely new justice system based on objective equity rather than tribal affiliation.
Right, massive paradigm shift.
World-altering ideas. But as long as you remain confined within a violently hostile environment that actively suppresses their implementation, these ideas remain entirely invisible.
They're just thoughts in a room.
Exactly. They remain theoretical. The travel, the physical migration, was the required catalyst to manifest those invisible ideological concepts into a tangible, visible reality. You have to move the idea out of the vacuum for it to become a system.
Okay, I was trying to wrap my head around this mechanism, and the best way I can visualize it is by looking at the difference between theoretical physics and applied engineering.
I love that analogy.
Right, because for 13 years in Mecca, the principles of this new societal revolution were purely theoretical. The visionary and his followers were in a violently hostile environment, essentially working out the complex math of a new society.
Testing the limits.
Testing their hypotheses under the most extreme, crushing pressure imaginable. They were proving the concepts of equity and resilience internally. But you cannot build a massive, complex suspension bridge inside a tiny, cramped laboratory.
You definitely can't.
Especially not while the ruling elite are actively throwing rocks through the windows and trying to burn the lab down.
Right, it's just not going to happen.
The ideas were perfect, but the environment could not sustain the build. The travel was the necessary moment when the finalized blueprints were taken out of the theoretical lab and brought to a massive, open construction site so they could actually build the machine.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic logic the source is conveying. The transition from theoretical physics to applied engineering absolutely requires a change in environment. And if we connect this to a broader human truth, something deeply relevant to you, the listener, it raises a profoundly challenging personal question.
Which is?
How long do we keep our own ideas, our own personal revolutions, internal and invisible?
Oh, wow.
Because we all have these theoretical blueprints for how we want to change our lives, right? How we want to restructure our businesses or how we want to impact our communities.
Sure.
But the natural law outlined in this text suggests that ideation is deeply insufficient on its own. At a certain point, ideation must transition into implementation, and that transition almost universally requires movement.
Requires getting out of your current space.
It requires a disruption of your current stasis. You cannot scale a revolution, whether it's personal or societal, in the very environment that is actively designed to suppress it. You have to take the blueprint to the construction site.
But that raises a massive logical problem for me.
Okay, what is it?
If the goal was always to build the machine somewhere else, if the laboratory of Mecca was never going to be the construction site, why endure the 13 years of absolute torment in the first place?
Ah, I see what you're getting at.
Right, why go through the boycotts, the starvation, the constant threat of assassination? If the natural law dictates that you need a favorable environment to build, why not just pack up and start at the construction site on day one?
Why stay in the lab while it's burning?
Exactly. Why didn't the visionary just move immediately to Medina or anywhere else and start building the equitable society without the 13 years of trauma? This brings us to what I think is the most visceral, uncompromising part of this entire lecture: the social physics of Mecca.
Yes, the mechanics of a mission. The text does not view those 13 years as wasted time or unfortunate suffering. It outlines a brutal but absolutely necessary natural law of societal change.
Break that down.
When a visionary is born into a society, realizes the objective truth, and begins the work of reform, their very first mandate is to begin dismantling the idols. And the source is exceptionally clear on this point. It is not talking about literal stone statues sitting in a courtyard.
Right. It is talking about the invisible architecture of the society, the systems.
Precisely. The true idols are the vested interests. They are the deeply ingrained false beliefs that justify inequality. They are the economic monopolies that hoard wealth. They are the corrupt power structures that demand subservience.
The status quo.
Yes. And when a visionary introduces a paradigm of absolute equity and universal law, they are not just challenging someone's abstract theology. They are directly threatening the elite's wallet, their social status, and their unearned power.
And people do not give that up easily.
Never. Therefore, massive, organized, violent opposition is not an unfortunate accident or a failure of diplomacy. It is a mathematical certainty in the realm of social physics. The old system must attempt to crush the new system.
And the lecture provides us with this incredibly gritty operational analogy to explain the function of that opposition. It calls that 13-year period of Meccan persecution the whetstone.
The whetstone.
In Urdu, the term used is asin. When I read that, it completely changed my view of historical adversity.
How so?
Well, think about a blacksmith shop. It is not a gentle environment, it is brutal. The friction against the grinding wheel is immense, the heat is unbearable, the noise is deafening, and sparks are flying everywhere.
It's violent.
It is violently loud and dangerous. When you take a piece of raw, unrefined metal and press it against a spinning whetstone, you are not destroying the metal. You are actively, violently grinding away all the useless, soft, compromised material. You're stripping away the impurities to sharpen the edge.
That friction is the only known mechanism to test and forge the integrity of the material. A blade simply cannot be sharpened without the violent resistance of the stone.
Right.
But the text doesn't stop there. It layers on a second, equally operational analogy to explain the role of the visionary within that brittle environment: the magnet.
The magnet, right?
The visionary, the messenger, was not just enduring the whetstone passively. He was acting as a highly charged magnet, moving deliberately through the dust, the dirt, and the grit of a highly corrupt society.
So if we combine the analogies, you have this magnet pulling through the dirt while the whetstone is simultaneously grinding everything down. What is the actual function of that dual process, like sociologically?
The precise function of a magnet moving through violently hostile grit is extraction. The goal is to extract the pure iron particles.
Okay, pure iron.
Look at the sociological landscape of Mecca. In a society completely dominated by vested interests, passive bystanders, and people who benefit from corruption, how do you identify the individuals who actually possess the moral fortitude to build a new civilization?
You definitely can't do it through surveys.
No, or polite conversation. You need a crucible. Who are the people willing to endure the sparks of the whetstone? Who are the individuals whose internal moral compass is so perfectly aligned with truth that they are irresistibly pulled by the magnet despite knowing that attaching themselves to it guarantees pain?
It guarantees economic ruin and social exile.
Exactly. It's the ultimate test.
It is the ultimate uncompromising filtration system for human capital.
Yeah.
You are separating the people who just like the idea of equity from the people who are willing to literally bleed for it.
Exactly. And the text emphasizes a crucial reframing of these extracted particles, these companions who endured the 13-year whetstone.
This part blew my mind.
Modern historical narratives often look back at oppressed groups with a sense of pity. We view them as weak victims who were trampled by the powerful elite until they managed to escape.
Like they were just helpless.
But the lecture vehemently argues against that framing. It rejects the victimhood narrative entirely. It describes each of these individuals who survived the extraction process as a son or a pearl.
A son or a pearl.
Yes. The specific phrase used is radiyallahu anhum, meaning the divine was pleased with them. The text's argument is that they were not broken by the whetstone. They were completely refined by it. They were the highly forged, uncompromising human capital that was mathematically necessary to build a new civilization.
Because you simply cannot build a durable, paradigm-shifting society using unrefined, untested material.
You really can't.
If you try to build a bridge with soft, compromised metal, it collapses the moment weight is applied.
Precisely. Think about your earlier question. Why not move on day one? If the visionary had just moved to a safe location on day one and said, hey, let's build an equitable society, he would have attracted everyone.
Oh, totally. The bandwagon effect.
He would have attracted the opportunists, the weak-willed, the people who just wanted a comfortable life in a nice utopian state. And the moment the new society faced external pressure, which it inevitably would, those people would have crumbled, the new civilization would have collapsed from within.
Because the material was soft.
Exactly. The 13 years of violent opposition in Mecca were a strict requirement of social physics. It was the only way to guarantee that the foundation of the new system was built entirely out of pure, tested, unbreakable iron.
That reframing is so deeply powerful. They were not helpless victims running away. They were the forged elite.
The forged elite, yes.
And that realization perfectly sets up the next major theme of the source material, which addresses one of the most common historical critiques of this era.
The Hijrah.
The true nature of the Hijrah, the migration from Mecca to Medina. Because, as the text notes, critics, both historical and modern, often point to this Meccan period and say, look at them. They were weak, they were impoverished by the boycotts, they were being tortured, and eventually they just couldn't take it anymore, so they ran away.
The escapism argument.
Right. The critique frames the migration as an act of sheer cowardice. It is labeled as escapism.
Farar,
yes. And the lecture fiercely and almost mathematically dismantles this myth of escapism.
How does it do it mathematically?
By strictly following the logic of the analogies we just discussed. If we accept the premise that the entire purpose of the 13-year Meccan period was to act as a whetstone and a magnet, a deliberate process designed to extract the pure iron particles from the useless societal grit, then we have to ask a logical question.
Which is?
What is the logical next step once the extraction is complete?
Well, once you have all the iron, you leave the dirt. You turn off the magnet and you walk out of the shop.
Exactly. Once the magnet has successfully extracted all the pure iron that existed within that specific societal cross-section, there is zero logical reason to leave those highly refined particles in a hostile environment where they are just constantly being ground down by the whetstone for no further gain.
That makes perfect sense. The environment in Mecca had yielded all the human capital it was ever going to yield. Every single individual with the capacity for truth and the resilience to endure the whetstone had already been extracted.
Mine was empty.
The mine was totally empty. So to stay in Mecca at that point would not be an act of bravery or steadfastness. According to the text, it would be a direct violation of the natural law of progress. It would be strategic malpractice to let your refined iron turn into dust just to prove you aren't afraid of the whetstone.
Okay, I understand the logic of leaving once the extraction is done. I really do. But let me push on the reality of what that migration actually entailed.
Sure, push back.
Because even if Mecca has nothing left to offer, isn't it still incredibly dangerous to leave your home turf?
It's terrifying.
You know the alleys of Mecca, you understand the tribal dynamics, you know who your enemies are. If you migrate to Medina, which is hundreds of miles away, you are essentially starting from absolute zero in a completely new market.
Right.
You are arriving as refugees with no wealth, no local alliances, and no structural power. Leaving the grit to protect the iron makes sense theoretically, but practically, moving into the unknown seems just as likely to destroy the movement, doesn't it?
That is the conventional, superficial view of migration, that it is merely a desperate leap into the dark to avoid immediate pain.
Okay.
But the source corrects this misunderstanding by introducing the critical concept of tamakan,
Tamakan.
which translates basically to acquiring authority or establishing a firm footing. We have to realize that this was not a disorganized flight of terrified refugees. They were not merely seeking asylum.
You weren't looking for a safe house.
They were not looking for a quiet refugee camp where they could just survive and practice their rituals in peace. They were executing a highly strategic repositioning of this elite, refined human capital to a favorable environment, specifically to forge it into a functioning sovereign system.
They migrated to establish a state.
They migrated to establish a state.
Wow. So this is the exact moment the theoretical physics moves out of the laboratory and onto the construction site.
Precisely. This is presented in the text as a permanent, immutable law of social physics. Ideation absolutely requires a favorable environment to transition into implementation.
You need the right soil.
You endure the crucible to extract the pure iron out of the grit, but once you have it, you must bring it to the forge and you must build the machine. Hijrah in this framework is never escapism.
It's evolution.
It is evolution. It is the necessary process of taking raw, refined potential and organizing it into tangible civilizational power. It is moving from being a persecuted ideology to being an implemented system of governance.
So they execute the blueprint. They make the move. They take this elite human capital forged in the whetstone of Mecca. They migrate to Medina, and they actually start building the machine.
They actually do it.
And by all accounts, it works. They establish this model system based on the principles they suffered for: equity, objective justice, reason, and divine law. They eliminate the corrupt monopolies within their new borders. But of course, the story does not end with everyone living happily ever after in their new utopian state.
It never does.
Because systems do not exist in a vacuum. The text outlines the severe civilizational consequences of this success, which culminates in the Battle of Badr. And the logic the source uses to explain why this battle happened is chillingly precise.
It's entirely systemic.
Right. Once this model system was successfully established in Medina, the disbelievers, the elite old guard back in Mecca, simply couldn't ignore it, could they? Even though the Muslims had left and were no longer in their city, the Meccans couldn't just let them be.
They absolutely could not ignore it. And it comes back to the fundamental nature of the systems involved. We have to look at the macroeconomics and the social physics at play here. If this paradise on earth, this equitable, just, transparent society in Medina succeeded and proved to be a viable alternative, it represented an immediate existential threat to the corrupt system back in Mecca.
How so?
Because they were so far away.
Think about it. If the surrounding tribes and populations see a fully functioning system operating next door, without economic monopolies, without the exploitation of the weak, and without a hoarded concentration of wealth, the old guard's global credibility instantly crumbles.
Wow.
The illusion that this is just how society has to be is shattered.
Look, they're doing it over there and it works.
Exactly. The Meccan elite's vested interests were doomed the moment Medina proved that equity was practical. Therefore, the Meccan attack at Badr was not just out of spite or lingering anger over the Muslims leaving.
It wasn't revenge.
It was a desperate, mandatory immune response by a dying paradigm trying to violently crush the cure before it could spread.
The old guard has to destroy the new paradigm before it scales, because if it scales, they are obsolete.
So that brings us to the climax of the source's argument, the defining moment at the Battle of Badr. The text details this incredibly tense, heavily charged moment where the prophet, standing on the battlefield, makes a very specific prayer to the divine.
A very famous prayer.
Yes. And again, true to form, the source asks us to look entirely past the traditional, purely emotional reading of this event. Historically, people read this as a terrified leader, begging for his life and the lives of his friends, because they're drastically outnumbered by a heavily armed Meccan army.
Yes, the lecture completely reframes this prayer, elevating it from an emotional plea to a cold, strictly logical statement of civilizational consequence.
Setting the scene is so important here.
Picture the scene as the text describes it. The prophet is standing on the battlefield. He is looking at this small, highly outnumbered group of companions. These are the exact individuals, the pure iron particles, that were painstakingly extracted over 13 grueling years of the whetstone in Mecca.
The refined elite.
Right. And his prayer to the divine is essentially framed as a rigid mathematical equation regarding the laws of human history. The prayer is, if this small group is destroyed today, there will be no one left to uphold your system until the end of time.
Let that sink in. If this small group of extracted iron particles is destroyed today, there will be no one left to uphold your system until the end of time. When you understand the 13 years of mechanics that led to that moment, that statement is staggering.
It is heavy.
It is not about personal survival at all. It is about the survival of the blueprint.
Exactly. It highlights the sheer finality and the unbearable weight of the moment. According to the paradigm established in the text, because he was the final messenger, there was no backup plan.
No plan B.
The system was closed. There was not another visionary waiting in the wings to come down the pipeline in 50 years to start the 13-year magnet and whetstone process all over again. The human capital required to build the system had been gathered. This was it.
It all came down to this.
This was the ultimate, final stand for the permanent values of reason, equity, and divine law against the deeply entrenched forces of vested interests and corruption. The logic is absolute. If the refined iron is lost on the sands at Badir, the machine is never built, the system is never implemented, and the blueprint for human equity is lost to history forever.
It is the ultimate bottleneck of human history, according to this framework. Everything, all the suffering, the linguistics of Subhan, the migration, it all funnels into this single binary moment on the battlefield.
Yes.
And what I find so compelling about this analysis is how seamlessly this ancient introduction, this Tajdid, connects to the broader permanent mechanics of global affairs, even the ones we're living through today.
Oh, it's incredibly relevant.
The text is not just telling us a story about the 7th century. It is handing us a diagnostic lens to view any civilizational struggle in any era. Whenever a new paradigm based on truth, transparency, and equity arises, the old guards, the entrenched systems built on exploitation, monopolies, and vested interests, will always mathematically, aggressively try to crush it. They have no other choice.
It's an immune response.
And the survival of that new equitable paradigm never relies on the passive majority who just agree with the ideas in theory. The survival of the new system always, inevitably relies on that highly refined, magnet-extracted core group holding the line when the old guard launches its desperate attack.
That is the enduring structural lesson of the social physics presented in this lecture. It shifts our perspective entirely. We move from viewing history as a series of random, chaotic events or magical interventions to seeing it as the operation of immutable, natural laws.
Which is so much more empowering.
It is. The clash between vested interests and truth is inevitable. The necessity of a brutal whetstone to forge resilient human capital is inevitable. The requirement of a strategic migration, a change in environment to implement a theoretical system, is inevitable. By understanding these mechanics, we stop staring at the artifact behind the glass, and we finally understand how the machine actually works.
So let's take a breath and recap the incredible journey this source material just took us on.
It's been a lot.
We started by looking at a single verse, Surah 17, verse 1, and confronting the psychological trap of the placeholder problem, where we treat ancient texts as passive, mystical fairy tales.
A museum glass.
Right. But by applying the rigorous lens of Lecture 117, we revealed that verse as the opening act of a masterclass in social physics. We unpacked the profound linguistic power of the word subhan, redefining it from a superstitious chant to a bold declaration of systemic structural dominance against a corrupt elite.
They were out of reach.
We saw how the travel at night was not an act of cowardice, but the necessary engine of reason required to turn an invisible theoretical revolution into a tangible reality.
Taking the blueprint to the construction site.
Exactly. We analyzed the brutal, unforgiving friction of the Meccan whetstone and the deliberate pull of the visionary magnet, working together to extract the pure iron of human capital.
The forging of the elite.
We dismantled the myth of escapism, redefining migration Hijrah as the strategic, necessary repositioning required to build the sovereign state. And finally, we witnessed the ultimate civilizational stakes at Badir, where that highly refined iron had to hold the line against the desperate immune response of a dying, corrupt old guard.
It is a profound and necessary shift from reverence without understanding to conviction through reason. We have deconstructed the mechanics of the blueprint.
We really have.
But before we conclude, the implications of these natural laws raise a deeply important, almost uncomfortable question for all of us.
Which we promise to leave the listener with.
Right. If we accept the premise of this text, that the whetstone of adversity is not an accident, but the mandatory mechanism designed to separate the pure iron from the useless grit, we have to look inward. We have to apply this social physics to our own lives.
Okay, listener, listen up.
What is the whetstone in your own life right now that is currently refining your core values? When you face immense friction, are you letting it grind you down into passive gust? Or are you allowing it to strip away your impurities and sharpen your resolve?
That's a huge question.
And perhaps most importantly, when the time comes when you have finally extracted the truth from your own hostile environment, are you ready to make your own migration to a favorable environment to actually build something real?
A heavy, beautiful, and demanding thought to mull over. The machine simply cannot be built in the dust. Eventually, you have to find the courage to move to the forge.
You have to move.
This has been an absolutely massive paradigm shift in how we read and understand these texts. But the blueprint is vast, and the text is not even close to being done with us yet.
Not even close.
In Lecture 217, we will explore the specific laws governing the rise of Bani Israel and the intellectual prerequisites for their era of dominance. Catch you on the next deep dive.